Okay, so here we are, our first panel of the day. I'm really excited to be here. This panel is on a non-degree credential quality standards and frameworks. So very excited to have a great group of panelists here today with us. So Lindsay Reichen-Cruz is a senior fellow at the National Skills Coalition, where she leads the organization's work on post-secondary education, among many other things. We have Melanie Booth from the Higher Learning Commission, who's the executive director of the Credentials Lab at the HLC. And then Suzanne Towns, managing director of EQUOS, which is a partnership between Burning Glass Institute and Jobs for the Future, focused on implementing quality standards for non-degree credentials. So we're going to keep this panel kind of informal today, have more of an open discussion among our panelists. I have some questions for them, and certainly we're open to questions from you all to keep this as more of a dialogue. But to get us started, I'm just going to ask each of our panelists, maybe just going from this one side to the next, to share a little bit about the efforts that they are each working on at their organizations related to non-degree credential quality and standards. We have a lot going on here, so I will pass the mic here, and we'll just pass this back and forth as our conversation goes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay. It's great to be here. As you just heard, I'm with the National Skills Coalition. We're a national nonprofit based in DC, but with staff around the country that has a mission to fight for a national commitment to inclusive and high quality skills training. We're one of the policy nonprofits that's involved with NCRN. We do some research as well as engaging with states, and we've been working with states for over, more than the past 4 or 5 years, but particularly on quality non-degree credentials in that time frame. Thanks in large part to Kermit over here, who kicked off a lot of our work on quality. And so we have held a number of technical assistance academies with states to help them define quality, create quality assurance frameworks that can help them identify the credentials that will help them meet state education and workforce goals. And also working with them to think about the policies that can support the attainment of quality non-degree credentials, and make sure they have the data and capacity needed to be able to say something meaningful about credential quality, as well as the outcomes of the people who earn those credentials and whether or not those outcomes are equitable. A lot of this work has been based on a set of quality criteria that we developed in partnership with a few states who were thinking about quality around 2019. These criteria include a number of elements that I think everybody's probably thinking about when they hear the word quality when it comes to credentials. Is there evidence of substantial job opportunities, so demand? Are they employer validated that those credentials are valuable? Do they confer the skills and competencies that are needed to fill in demand jobs? What are the employment and earnings outcomes associated with those credentials? And are those credentials stackable and portable, which are, of course, are important for learner outcomes. We're also starting to think a little bit more about some informal elements of quality that aren't represented in those criteria. So for example, is financial aid and holistic supports, which we know are essential to access and equitable outcomes, available to folks who are pursuing quality non-degree credentials. So in the non-credit space, for example, we know that's much fewer and far between than on the credit side of this conversation. What are the quality of the jobs that people get with those credentials at the end of the day, beyond just wages? So obviously a wage premium is important, but do those jobs have benefits? Do they have paid family and medical leave, et cetera? And then finally, a corollary to this conversation of quality credentials are the quality of the programs and providers that are offering pathways to earning them. That has to be taken into account as well. So of course, we're seeing a lot of new investment, increasing investment from states in non-degree credentials and pathways. Thanks to Stephanie's work, we know that upwards of $4 billion is being invested in these credentials and pathways, a lot of it which is going towards financial aid. And ultimately, we think these quality definitions and frameworks are essential because policymakers need to be able to identify where their dollars should be invested. Are they going towards the credentials that are really going to lead to economic mobility for the people who earn them? Are they going to meet the needs of employers who have growing and in-demand jobs and need the talent pool to hire from? And workers and students, of course, need to know how to make decisions, which credentials will actually help them achieve their goals, which are going to help them advance their careers, and where can they find them, right? All of that information is really important for decision making in this context. So I just wanted to share a little bit about some of upcoming publications that we're going to be releasing that speak to this sort of to this topic from the perspective of state policymakers in particular. So we've put together a roadmap for states who want to look to the future of how they can develop a robust non-degree credential data and quality ecosystem. So how can they get to a place where they can answer questions like which non-degree credentials are in demand locally, regionally, statewide, which are high quality? What are the types of jobs those credentials lead to? What are the quality of those jobs? Where can people earn those credentials? What are the economic benefits that people can expect at the end of the day when they earn them? And that rubric also, excuse me, that roadmap also includes a rubric. Some of you may have seen this. We were circulating it to get feedback, and we've used it to engage with states and partners over the last few months. The rubric really focuses on that data foundation that is necessary for us to be able to say anything concrete about non-degree credential quality and the outcomes of people who earn them. So it includes benchmarks and sort of, it's an ideal state. We don't expect any state to have achieved all of this in the rubric, but we want it to be able to help states assess where they are now and where they might want to go with regard to non-degree credential data and information. So it talks about the data practices and capacities that states need to have, like collecting data on non-credit credentials and feeding that up to different data systems at the state level, disaggregating those data by race, ethnicity, gender, age, et cetera, to answer equity questions and matching to UI records as well as data from other systems that can answer questions about the factors that we know are important for educational attainment but may not show up in solely education and workforce data information. It includes the collection of key data. So what variables do you need to be thinking about? Everything from non-degree credential related program enrollment and attainment to program and provider details. How much do these programs cost, right? Really important if we're thinking about investing in financial aid to help students get access to these programs without taking on debt. And the systems, policies, and infrastructure that are necessary to undergird all of this. So can the system collecting data on non-degree credentials talk to the systems that have other types of data? Can the credit system talk to the non-credit system, or can they be integrated? And how are we communicating this? Well, I'm skipping one. And data sharing, of course, is huge. And then transparency reporting. So how are we communicating this information out to the people who need it to make decisions? Policymakers, education and workforce providers, employers, and of course, students and learners. Consumer-facing data tools are becoming more common at the state level, but they need to be tailored to the audience they're intended to support, and they need to be connected to the types of information that can really help people make those decisions. So we're seeing some progress in that space, but I think the more data, the better, of course. And then finally, I just want to mention one additional report coming out in June that looks at the financial aid landscape for non-degree credentials. We look at 5 states, 6 programs in 5 states: Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, Virginia, and Washington. And we think about the design choices that you have to make when designing financial aid for non-degree credentials. So there are some issues that span financial aid kind of regardless of what you're talking about, but there are some issues that are specific to non-degree credentials, and that's what we come into. And so we talk about everything from how states are thinking about covering the non-tuition costs and providing holistic supports for folks who are pursuing these credentials, as well as how they're applying quality assurance to the credentials and the programs that are eligible in the first place, which of course is going to become more and more important as people want to avail themselves of these credential opportunities more and more. So I'll stop there and pass it on.
Ditto to all of that. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see so many friends and colleagues here, and thank you for including me in this panel. My name is Melanie Booth. I'm the executive director of a new division within the Higher Learning Commission called the Credential Lab. We are intentionally separate from accreditation, but Higher Learning Commission for the last 8 years has really been studying the changing ecology of post-secondary education and really trying to better understand the impact and the effect of that on accreditation, on quality assurance, on learners, and on institutions. And out of this work, much of which was funded by Lumina Foundation, came an understanding around this changing credential landscape and what that will mean in the midst of helping institutions better connect learners to employment on ramps and up ramps and further education, and that those two things are not mutually exclusive. And how do we think about learn work and work learn as collective activities? Out of all of that was born the Credential Lab. I came on as a consultant last spring and helped do some feasibility testing and conceptualizing of what was needed in the space. And in September, we launched a two-part work stream. One is a quality assurance endorsement process for credential content providers that are not colleges and universities. And we're looking at that provider level. And we have a fabulous design team working with us to help design that. We're at the very, very beginning stages of that work. And some of you in the room are involved in that. So we're grateful for the collaboration and the participation in that. Part of the theory of change is, and at this key moment, I think we're all thinking there's kind of a paradigm shift that actually feels like it's finally happening. I've been in this space my entire career, and I feel like there's finally momentum and collaboration, so that we're rowing the boat in the same direction, and we're not recreating policies that don't actually convey what we need learning to be about. So that's our one work stream. Our second work stream that is a little bit behind that with generous funding from ECMC Foundation is a Credential Lab Innovation Center that will be for educational providers of all kinds to help raise the tide, raise those boats. As we continue to rely on many of your organizations and research coming out of this network to really help understand what effective practice is and how we think about institutional redesign. Change leadership is a really big part of that. We don't want just a whole bunch of colleges and universities proliferating a bunch of badges that don't really convey much beyond the concerns that degrees signal right now. We don't want to recreate inadvertently some of the equity issues and the educational disparities that our current system has. So I believe we're on a trajectory to a new way of being together, and it's my privilege to be in the room with all of you to push toward that new way of being in responsible and thoughtful ways. One final thing I'll comment on is that while our title is Credential Lab, it is obviously involves all of the other elements of these changes, right? It involves thinking about one of the comments you made. We have divisions. We have division of continuing ed, and then there's traditional ed. We have we have these structural disincentives in our systems to change. So the Credential Lab will also be working on things like, how do we really think about all learning counting? How do we promote learning as a way of being? And what does that mean for, I don't even want to use the word pedagogy because it's not the right terminology, and nor is andragogy. It's a new goji. How do we think about the intentional design and move away from inoculation practices in learning? So all of that is part of it as well. And key partnerships will be essential to, I think, to all of us helping work with these changes in ways that ultimately promote success for learners, and learners being a very large population, including all of us, and not current students that are or are not being served. So I think that's all I'll say for now, and I'll pass it to my friend Suzanne.
Thanks, Mel. Good morning, everyone. Like, you are such a hard act to follow. I'm Suzanne. I know, like, the amazing talent that's up here with me. So good morning. I'm Suzanne Towns. I'm the managing director of an organization called EQUOS. Quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of EQUOS? Some friends in the room. Hi. And so EQUOS stands for Education Emphasize the O for outcomes. And so we have developed a quality standard framework that really reverse engineers our evaluation based on outcomes from real folks. And as somebody who's spent 20 years plus, more than I'll admit to, in the workforce space as both a funder and someone in a workforce board seat and someone who would have been haranguing many of you around what can you help me know about the people we're trying to serve or the investments that we're making or what is actually happening to people. Right? The data systems are fragmented. How can we knit all this together and try to make decisions in real time with limited resources and access that centers inclusive growth and mobility, right? Like it's a big deal to know what's happening based on where people are going with which credentials they've obtained. And so EQUOS is operated in partnership between Jobs for the Future and Burning Glass Institute. And so we have the benefit of having the ground game and the reach and the education and the awareness and the testing that JFF is investing in, and then the incredible data capacity and analytics and sort of groundbreaking work that BGI is driving. I would be highly remiss if I did not call out and recognize my colleague, Kat Kiernan, who's here today, who's part of our research team that is driving a lot of our work. And so I just want to give her a shout out and make sure that you know who she is. And so our framework really looks at 5 core dimensions. And so similar to what you were saying, Lindsay, and I know where you're going, Melanie, we are looking at employment outcomes, right? So where are people are going and how much are they making? What can we know about their pathways? So opportunity, do those, does their pathway lead to high wage? Does it lead to mobility and advancement? Are there things that are, transferable? How competitive are the skills? So we're looking at learnings, right? What are the skills that align to specific credentials and specific pathways? An area we're excited to explore is what's relevant or sticky over time. Where do we see some shifts or where do we see, as there's increasing recognition of a skills approach, what remains competitive? And that aligns to demand, right? To what extent is the credential recognized in the market? Or where does it lead to? Application, right? And growth, and then who is obtaining and where are they going and what are the underlying demographics and what does that tell us about where there are opportunities for specific folks. And so we've updated our framework. We also have a pretty incredible data set. So we've got 19, almost 20 million observations in the data set, and we have spent the last year cleaning and organizing that information. And so we've cleaned down to just under 4 million people. And we've looked at how we're grouping credentials either by credential name or credential category and skill. And then what does that allow us to see in terms of, right, specific providers? And so we are zooming in initially on a couple of key areas. We're looking at specific sectors that relate to healthcare, technology, green infrastructure. Where do we see a high amount of opportunity for people to use non-degree credentials? And where might we compare industries that are more regulated and structured in terms of what is required versus where is there more of the Wild West that so many of us talk about when we talk about non-degree credentials? We're also thinking about, where might we look at specific populations to see what is happening, whether it's veterans, whether it's folks that are justice involved, or where we might look at specific geographies, right? And where might we compare and contrast what we're seeing in terms of opportunities for folks with the same credential, looking at the same occupations, right, in different areas to see what is happening. So there's just been a tremendous amount of work in development as we're piloting the application of our framework. And then we want to make sure that the information and the learnings are accessible. And so we are hard at work on piloting some of our initial use cases and where might we build products and tools and resources to help the work that you all are doing. We're initially looking at 2 areas. So we're looking at talent matching. So how might we support employers that are thinking about how to really operationalize the commitment to skills-based practices and recognizing the value of non-degree credentials? And then how do we look at career navigation? And so for workers and learners and providers and investors and other stakeholders in the ecosystem, right? How can they use information about credential evaluation and quality to help inform those choices? And then lastly, which brings me to my excitement to be here today, we're not walking this alone, right? And there's incredible value in partnership. And so how do we think about building momentum for our work and really supporting so much work that's happening in this room and learning from you as we're informing our approach? And so we have launched an action network. We've got just under 20 partners and growing. And within that, we're small and those when they practice and learn how to inform some of the work we're doing and really make sure that what we are building from an architectural point of view in terms of common metrics or data or right, all of the different taxonomies, how do we look at alignment so that it is more easily interoperable with some of the work that you're doing? So I will pause there and hand it back to you, Michelle.
Mike for us. So this is great. It's wonderful to be on this panel with this great group. I should say that actually at Rutgers, we actually just did a landscape scan of non-degree credential quality and folks who are working in this area. So it's wonderful to have everybody here on this panel to share about that, the work that each of them is doing in that area. So I encourage you to take a look at our report and learn more about, what each of these folks are doing, as well as many others who I think are in the audience but may not be on this panel, and others in the field as well. But we have some really, really interesting work going on. So it's wonderful to hear from each of you. And I wanted to ask you, I think just to begin our conversation here, maybe if each of you could comment for a moment on, just to put this in context for us, what are some of the key drivers that you see behind this growing interest in non-degree credentials? What are some of the drivers in our landscape right now? Just briefly comment.
I still have the mic. I think it's where I started, right? There are billions of dollars being spent in the space, over 1 million credentials, somewhere in the area of 600,000 or 700,000 non-degree credentials, right? Things are changing so quickly, and yet we don't know what works. We don't know what the return on the investment is beyond certain bounds, right? And we want to make sure that we are continuing to inform and support continuous improvement in the field and equitable outcomes for people who are participating.
I'll speak specifically to, because I know that you'll speak to some other elements of this, specifically to some of the drivers facing colleges and universities, which are no surprise, this idea of the enrollment cliff of traditional students, but also the real needs and the value of traditional degrees being severely questioned, and for good reason in some cases. And so I think that there's, on behalf of institutions, a real impetus to change. Part of it is survival, but part of it is actually genuinely coming to realize that learners' needs are different and learners are different. And so the structures and systems that may have worked 30 years ago are no longer working. They're no longer able to rapidly respond to the changes in the ecosystem. Employer partnerships look different. Career development and career services look different. When we think about the 40.5 million, and Holly will remind us that does not include graduate students who have some credit and no credential, something is not working. And so I think that finally there's this opportunity, and one of the real drivers is around changing systems to better support learners and actually realizing the mission of many colleges and universities to be organizations that promote lifelong.
Yeah, I mean, I'll double down on your point just now, Melanie. Speaking from an adult learner perspective, if you're a parent with a job and a low income and you want to get ahead, committing to a quote unquote 2 or 4 year degree may not be in the cards, especially with the levels of college tuition and the debt that follows. It's just not, it's not as realistic. So I think from that demand sense, there's a real need to kind of adapt to people's needs, and for folks who are trying to get ahead in their careers, technology, AI, like the job market is changing, technology is changing, employer needs are changing, and people are trying to meet those demands. States are trying to meet those demands and create a talent pool that can be flexible and fit the jobs that are out there and that are emerging. And individuals are trying to do that too. So it's just about trying to create that match. And yeah, I think there's a lot of questions left to answer. And I think maybe you said this earlier, someone said this earlier, there's so much investment and movement forward without consideration of all the data, all the research, all answers to the questions that we have. So we've sort of got cart before the horse, and I think we need to slow down a little bit and start to answer some of these.
Yeah, those are really important points, and I think this conversation is kind of also pointing out the fact that there are a lot of influences going on and a lot of stakeholder groups too that are invested in this. And I'm curious to hear from each of you if you just comment on the sort of the different stakeholders that we're balancing here that are influencing this process, that are concerned about quality, and perhaps their different priorities or similar priorities when it comes to this question of defining what quality is and promoting it.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from the perspective of maybe states and learners. I think states are really, and they have a set of strategic goals usually. They have post-secondary attainment goals. They have workforce and other education goals, equity goals. And so they are hopefully orienting their investments and policies towards the quality credentials that will help achieve them. And there's a lot of dollars out there in the mix, which we've already said, that I think are influencing where this conversation goes. And I think from the perspective of students and workers, they want to know which credentials will get them to where they want to go. I mean, they want to know that the investment of their time and their finances are going to be worth it at the end of the day. I mean, that's sort of originally what the promise of higher education could give. And I think there are big questions about whether or not it's delivering. Non-degree credentials are sort of a new pathway that they're hoping to get that return on. But again, we know a little bit about it and not as much as we could. So I'll leave it there.
I'll just kind of stack onto that idea about, I think there's really interesting levers happening with the skills forward movement. How do we translate into knowledge, skills, and abilities, and what does that mean for our design and assessment? How do we make that visible on behalf of learners? And so I think that's a lot of that is coming from frustrated employers who are like, I can hire folks for this, whatever, this program's certificate, but I'm not seeing evidence that they have the application of the skills that I need. And that's the currency, that's the language. And so I think that's part of it too. I also really think that we can start to question who benefits and kind of interrogate through the research and the data and the evidence that everybody's working with here, trying to build a case for what I always want to say is why is the learner always the one who has to bear the cost, and particularly in high cost programs. Affordability is a really important aspect to learners. And I don't really think we've addressed that. I don't think we've cracked that nut, because I don't think we've always asked the right questions about it. We tend to start with how can we lower costs for learners, but maybe we should think about that differently. And I think that's one thing that's pushing on this right now too, thankfully.
That just took me so far back. Double click on that. And also, as we think about investors, whether it's public sector, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's people who are working to offset and defray the cost burden to learners and workers, the first thing we're going to be asked, personally been asked and scolded and strongly admonished from folks who are in an oversight role. Oh, we're spending all this money on this. We're going to cover the cost. What happens to people? Do they get jobs? Are they good jobs? Are they successful? What do we know about the quality of the investments that we're making, which, if you walk my pathway, you end up engaging many of the folks in this room in terms of what can you tell me so that I can make data informed decisions about where I'm spending money to make sure that people have information and transparency and resources to help them navigate that journey, and that we're making smart investments that lead to a real return for both the economy and the businesses and the worker. And we just often don't know. And if you ask that question often enough, then you end up at EQUIS.
Well, that points to a really, I think, interesting question and point here is what are some of the ways that we can collectively ensure quality? And so I think each of you have sort of begun to allude to some of the mechanisms, and that's some of the stuff that we've been trying to unpack in our research is the ways that we can ensure quality. What are some of the processes? What are some of the ways that we can collectively ensure quality?
I guess since I have
You
the
got
mic,
the
I'll
mic. I
start.
guess, Melanie.
Well, I think we all have seen numerous frameworks and skills frameworks, outcomes frameworks, articulating new kinds of outcomes, articulating pathways that move the needle for learners or groups. Those are all fabulous. I will speak specifically to part of the element that we're really looking at within the Credential Labs endorsement. And I put that in little air quotes because we don't know if that's what it's going to be called yet, but that will give you a sense of the concept. A big part of it for us around the provider level are significant protections for learners and investors. And so part of that is around like privacy, data control, does the learner own their learning record? Can they take it with them? Are the offerings that a provider, and I say provider totally understanding that all of this is really becoming unbundled. And so providers go through marketplaces and marketplaces go through colleges and colleges go through, it's all over the place right now. I'm going to go to Amazon to buy my cat food and get my next job. Like that's what's happening. And so in the midst of all of that, how do we make sure that learners are not being put in positions where they're at risk and also are being put in learning situations that advance their knowledge, that advances their skills and their abilities, and that also can recognize what they bring with them and build on that in an integrative way. So I will just stop there because these folks probably want to talk about outcomes.
Yes, of course. I think it's also important as we think about quality, right, that we think about a common definition. Because again, we may all have different things that we're looking at, whether it's provider-based or program design or what resources and supports are there, right? But there are a lot of common areas. You heard it as Lindsay was talking about her definitions. You heard it as we were talking about ours. And so how do we make sure as we're looking across frameworks and particular use cases, we're able to measure the same things and speak the same language, and we have a louder voice together around what we believe is important and shaping this discussion as it moves forward. And I think that gets us into collaboration. It gets us into thought leadership. It gets us into alignment, and I won't say advocacy, Kermit, promise, right? But like as we think about where different partners in the room have an ability to message forward what we think is really critical in shaping future state.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning this issue of language and definitions because we're all taking a different one. What we're seeing from states are, I'd say in general, I feel like the most progress we're seeing at the state level is when there's a particular use case that they're applying a quality assurance definition or framework to. So a financial aid program, or for example, in the case of Colorado, there was a stackable credential pathways bill that was passed in 2022. It required the establishment of a quality assurance definition and process. So they formed a work group, they got public comment, now they have a framework. And so they're going to start to use that to implement in the case of these particular bills that specify you have to do this, which I think is one way that states can start to incentivize and require that quality assurance process when it comes to non-degree credentials. As I said, we've done a lot of work looking at financial aid programs for non-degree credentials and how they're applying quality assurance. There are a lot of ways you can do this in terms of program eligibility. You can tie that eligibility to programs that lead to jobs on your in-demand job list. But of course, we know in-demand is also does not equal high wage or high quality. So how do you build those considerations into how you're approving programs and credentials for these financial aid investments as a way to promise to learners that, you doing this is going to lead to a positive return. And there are other examples. So I think like Tennessee, for example, just codified a definition of quality for a couple of specific financial aid programs last month. So it's with the governor. He's going to sign it. And it expands, for example, the Tennessee Promise Scholarship to quality non-degree credentials that fit the definition that are conferred by Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology. So we're seeing some progress in how states are actually really getting clear about how they think about quality and how they apply that in practice. I think there are a couple big questions connected to this. What's the data foundation that are undergirding these assessments of quality? Is there one? And how can we make that more robust? And how are we using that data information to keep programs, providers, and other key stakeholders accountable for the outcomes of their learners who earn these credentials? So is there an opportunity for continuous learning, for continuous improvement? We see that, for example, in the case of New Jersey, their ETPL now uses a quality assurance model. It's a sophisticated statistical model that takes into account program composition and holds programs on the ETPL accountable to a benchmark of outcomes. And if they fall below that benchmark, they have 2 years to basically get in line, and they get technical assistance and support from the Department of Labor and Workforce Development. But if they don't meet those outcomes in 2 years, then they lose eligibility for the ETPL. So I think that's one example of an accountability framework that can push forward some progress in terms of what we want to see for outcomes for learners and workers.
Oh. You go first. No. Okay. We had things to add, apparently. One of the things that we've really been thinking about and wrestling with around the quality question is at what level is aggregation helpful? And then when do we need to disaggregate? And so there's a lot of aggregation happening, and we can make a lot of broad assumptions. But ultimately, quality is actually quite contextual, right? And so what is quality in one industry is different in another industry. And we have to look at groups of learners and different dimensions of their backgrounds and their experiences and their strengths and their opportunities. So I always get cringy when we think about large sets of data that are aggregated. I think we have to be very thoughtful about disaggregating that data in the contextual purposes that it serves. Because what may work for one circumstance may actually be not workable for another circumstance. And so I think that's part of the value also to the earlier session about the value of the research network here is how can we inform each other's work around this and make and thoughtfully man. I want to, I don't know, I feel like it's a triple click at this point on that. There was a lot of discussion about the EQUOS quality evaluation when it previewed last year. And I can fully understand, as someone who is responsible from approving providers, who has also been a provider at some point in time, right? Like, what does it mean when you look at an evaluative score for a credentialer or credentialer provider and it performs lower? And as I think about, Amanda, your work and what we're hearing from people or from employers where they assume a positive value for people who've gotten a credential at all, how in our intent to look at quality outcomes and the return on investment are we strengths-based, and how do we ensure that there is not an unintended consequence of having a chilling effect for people who have a credential that performs lower? And so we are having a lot of conversations. There's 5 dimensions in our framework. There's an overall objective evaluation based on our definitions. We're also thinking about how do we disaggregate and how do we look at where we might see something that performs at a, average level overall, but when you zoom in terms of access or you zoom in terms of opportunity and specific populations, you see really strong benefits. And so how do we make sure we're not losing the learnings from what is working, even as we're pushing for a higher degree of quality? And so being strengths-based, thinking about how we support providers and we support employers and we support parts of the system to think about it from a continuous improvement point of view, and that we're building forward is critically important. Doesn't mean that if we find real bad actors or things that are not competitive and are not a good investment of time and resources generally, that we should also have direct conversations about that. But I think the nuance of this, and thank you, Michelle, for letting us dig in here, is critically important.
This is great. And I think this conversation really highlights the complexity of this landscape. And it's really interesting. And um, we have different stakeholders with different needs, potentially different definitions, but the need to coordinate them as well is also keep them contextual. So it's this interesting sort of like balancing act between all these different goals and outcomes and different stakeholders. And I think the richness of this conversation is really seeing that we have a lot of folks in this area and kind of also and I think doesn't completely perpetuate existing economic disparities. How do we think about this from an access and equity standpoint? So I'd be curious to hear from each of you just your thoughts on that topic.
So I feel like I alluded to it a little bit in my prior comments, but I think you talked about the OGs. I'm going to talk about the ilities, right? Like as we think about mobility, as we think about stackability, as we think about transferability, how do we look at it from a continuum point of view where somebody who's getting a credential that is a core component of a pathway to opportunity doesn't have a terminal step there, right? And how are we able to ensure that in terms of, people understanding with a level of transparency the value of the skills and competencies that they've obtained and to be able to think about how they stack from there or what resources are available, right? Or where and how we might have the opportunity to do a both and, right? I mean, I feel like we often talk about this in context of point of time to entry into employment. We're not necessarily talking at the same level, but I think we should about how we grow and maintain a competitive talent pool, right? As the economy shifts, as work changes, as you think about lifelong learning, right? And then that gets into who owns their data, right? And their learning and employment record. Like, what are some of the unlocks as we truly think about equity and opportunity for folks that we're serving?
What do I say? Click on that or something? Is that at some point, the whole mouse idea is going to go away because my head is going to say click and then that's on. But anyway, I think that there's a lot of I think we're in the part of the daily struggle of this for me personally, and I think for probably many of you, is that we're operating in one system while trying to create a new system, and being in two spaces as we move toward that is super hard, right? It's just really challenging work, and speaks to what Suzanne spoke about, the value of collaboration and thoughtfulness around this work. When I think of things like even our terminology, we have bias in our language about what we talk about when we call that's an academic program and that's a workforce program. That's for credit and that's not for credit. I remember at the higher learning conference, we had a panel with work cred were embedding industry certifications into associate's degrees. And the college said nobody wants to be called non-something, non-credit. So they kind of renamed it career program, career certificate or something like that. But it's true. Like, we have to really examine the language that we use with learners and what's invitational and strengths-based, and then what's actually off-putting. I fear that we might end up creating a tiered, like this tracked system versus an incremental system where, well, that's great for everybody else's kids, but not mine. Or that's great for our neighbors across the street, but not for, we don't want to do that. That's a problem we have now. I also think there's opportunity to look at all kinds of providers and really examine some of the practices that are not learner friendly and are learner friendly for some kinds of learners, but not others. And some of that is around funding. Some of it is around access. Some of it is around who owns records and gets them and has to, all of that. So if we really do want to avoid creating those things, we have to look at our language and our structures and where there are disincentives for change. Within colleges and universities, there are disincentives for taking in transfer credit. There are disincentives for looking at external sources of learning and counting it toward credit. And let's remember, credit is seat time, right? So like it's not learn. So we still have all these changes that I think we're trying to move toward. Or I'll speak for myself. And we're still existing in these systems, including the system where we have the Department of Labor and the Department of Education and other sources of funding that aren't always talking to each other.
I guess I want to go back to this, like, the idea of data disaggregation that we had in the last conversation, and you know, and this issue of kind of understanding the outcomes of particular groups and sectors and fields. I mean, I feel like early childhood education is like the quintessential example of a space where, when it comes to a quality definition, it's not really measuring up in a lot of ways, particularly in terms of job quality, but it's a vitally important sector where we need more trained workers, not only for, you know, caring for kids now, but for allowing the workforce and women to participate, and for building our future workforce. So it's not a simple question, and states are certainly grappling with this. And I think that broader question of how our focus on non-degree credentials without a quality focus can really reify occupational segregation, particularly for people of color, women of color, is something that has to be raised up. And, you know, looking at outcomes and data from, say, these financial aid programs in different states, you know, there's a lot of money going to people going into CDLs. And who do you think is getting those CDLs, right? It's not. And then they're, you know, like the program in Arkansas, like 80% or something, like a really large share of people who are receiving that Workforce Challenge Scholarship are going into healthcare. So what are the quality of those jobs, and who are getting those jobs? It's women and women of color. And I think saying this out loud and asking these questions, and then taking what we know about how to disrupt, you know, segregated patterns of employment and applying it to the space is essential, because without that lens, without that gender and equity lens, we're really going to reproduce those patterns. And I don't think that we're at a place where we know that these credentials can really push economic mobility to the place where we want to see it, that without that lens, we're going to get anywhere where we that's positive. So I think there was something else, but I forgot. So I'm going to give it back to Michelle.
Well, thank you. That's really great. I mean, I think that's important, and it really highlights the importance of the research and the data and all of this in terms of helping to unearth and make clear where some of those disparities could be coming from and exist. So I have one final question for you all quickly, in a minute each, perhaps. Just give us your future vision for non-degree credential quality. You know, where is this all headed? Where should we be going? What's your vision of where this goes? So just in 1 minute, give us that future vision, if you can each take a stab at that.
Well, I'll speak from NSC's state policy perspective. You know, states have the quality frameworks that they are implementing in practice according to use cases, supported by data that can give them information that they're using to inform those policies, and including getting that information into the hands of workers and learners so they can make informed decisions about their futures. I did it under a minute.
Yeah, that's speedy.
Click, double click. I gotta get that down. I think in the short term, I think there's an opportunity for much broader acceptance and of sources of learning that are not traditional academic sources of learning. I'm recreating the language that I just said we need to interrogate. But we need new terminology for all of this too. And so my long-term vision, and I'll speak to this personally, is that we can count all learning as learning, and we can acknowledge the knowledge, skills, and abilities. The stickiness, I really like that concept, because that means that you can build on that and you can continue on that. And it's not a sit and get and then you're done with that skill. You build and you build toward acknowledging that transparently and visibly as well for mobility purposes.
I would love to see a future state where we maximize the opportunity and potential of people who are attaining non-degree credentials. And we understand where they're going. They're leading to real equitable outcomes, and that stakeholders across the ecosystem have access to the information they need to really drive to those outcomes.
Well, there we go, in a nutshell. So we have just like a minute or two if there's anybody in the audience who's got a burning question or comment that you'd like to contribute to this discussion. Been very rich, a lot of good information.
Talk about and data shows that that's not the case. And so how would that change your narrative, both about transfer, equity, and value, when most people, like, there are very few people, for instance, who have a standalone certificate. So you're talking about non-degree credentials like it's the last thing you get. That's not how it is. So how would we change your
Thank you for saying that, because that's not how I see it. And I agree with you in terms of stackability. And I think when we look, we see, is that, no. Am I understanding your comment correctly? Okay. I just want to be sure before I say I agree and then you're like, that's not what I'm saying. I do think it is a both and. And I think people are either combining, especially as we think about lifelong learning, right? Like there are developmental, there's stackability. There are people who have degrees who are going back and getting secondary, tertiary credentials, et cetera, over the course of time. And so recognizing the value and impact of a credential in someone's journey, I think is important, whether it is a student's.
Question, then we have to wrap up.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, but not if they're coming back into the same system that didn't support them in the first place.
So curious to see what happens around the sort of credit for prior learning and where there might be some stacking of credentials towards degree conference. I feel like this isn't an area like I am the most expert in, but I feel like there is a lot of energy and discussion around a path forward. And I think building off of Mel's point around, we need to think about what the system and the structure is, right? And what we can do to transform those opportunities.
Well, I think we're actually at time, and this is a great discussion. I hope everyone continues these discussions afterwards. But I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and thank you all for your attention. And then